An elderly black man faces harsh humiliation in his hometown, but an unexpected confrontation could reveal more than anyone expected. How will this emotional encounter unfold? It was a brisk autumn morning in Savannah, Georgia. The leaves swirled in the breeze as 68-year-old Samuel Thompson made his way down the familiar cobblestone streets. Samuel had lived in this town his entire life. He had seen its seasons come and go, its streets change, and its people evolve, though some things, like deep-rooted prejudice, never seemed to fade. Samuel, tall and broad-shouldered despite his age, moved with a slow, deliberate grace. His graying hair was neatly combed back, and his weathered hands grasped his cane, which he didn't always need but kept for those days when the old injury from his time working on the docks would flare up. His brown eyes, though aged, still carried the spark of wisdom and resilience, a man who had lived through more than most could imagine. Today, Samuel was heading to McAllister's General Store, a place he had visited countless times in his youth but had grown wary of in recent years. Owned by Clyde McAllister, a man in his late 50s with a stout build and an ever-present scowl, the store had been in the McAllister family for generations. Clyde had inherited both the shop and his father's notorious attitude, an attitude that was not welcoming to those who didn't look like him. Samuel stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming its usual jingle. The smell of old wood and fresh produce filled the air, but as soon as he entered, the atmosphere shifted. Clyde, standing behind the counter, glanced up. His narrow eyes darkened, and his lips curled into a frown. Samuel, unfazed by the cold reception, gave a nod of acknowledgement. "Mornin', Clyde," he said, his deep voice echoing in the small space. Clyde grunted in response but didn't return the greeting. Samuel wasn't surprised. He had come to expect this kind of treatment over the years, especially from men like Clyde. But today, Samuel was determined to get what he needed and leave without confrontation. He walked slowly through the aisles, selecting a few basic items: bread, some fresh vegetables, and a carton of milk. As he moved towards the counter, he couldn't shake the feeling that Clyde's eyes were on him the entire time, watching, judging, waiting for him to make a wrong move. When Samuel placed his items on the counter, Clyde didn't move to scan them. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back. "What do you want, Samuel?" Clyde's voice was laced with disdain. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Just these," he said calmly, gesturing to the items. Clyde didn't budge. "Ain't sellin' to you today," he spat out. Samuel blinked, taken aback for a moment, but his calm exterior didn't falter. "And why's that?" Clyde scoffed. "This ain't your kind of store, Samuel. You should know better by now. There's other places for folks like you." Samuel's grip on his cane tightened. It wasn't the first time he had faced this kind of outright racism, but it didn't sting any less. "It's 2024, Clyde," he said, his voice steady but with an underlying strength. "Thought we were past all this." Clyde smirked, leaning forward. "Maybe in your world, but not in mine." There was a moment of silence, thick and heavy, as the two men stared at each other. Samuel could feel the weight of decades of history in this exchange. He thought of his father, who had lived through worse and taught him to hold his head high no matter what. But even a man as patient as Samuel had his limits. "I just want to buy my groceries, Clyde," Samuel said, his voice firm but restrained. Clyde didn't move. "I said no. Now get out before I make you." Samuel felt a flash of anger rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. There was no point in causing a scene. He had lived through far too much to let this small-minded man get the better of him. Without another word, Samuel turned and walked out of the store, the bell above the door jingling in his wake. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool autumn air hit his face, calming his rising frustration. But just as he began to walk away, his foot caught on something uneven in the pavement, and before he could catch himself, Samuel stumbled forward, landing hard on his knee. Pain shot through his leg, radiating up his back, and he gasped, clutching his cane to try and steady himself. A woman nearby rushed over. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Samuel winced, trying to get up but feeling the sharp sting in his knee. "I'm fine, just a little fall." But it wasn't fine. As the woman helped him to his feet, Samuel could feel the pain intensifying. His knee, already weakened by years of strain, throbbed painfully, and he knew something was wrong. "You need to get that looked at," the woman said, her brow furrowed with worry. Samuel nodded, though the frustration inside him grew. First, the humiliation at the store, and now this. It seemed like the universe was conspiring against him today. With the woman's help, Samuel hobbled to a nearby bench and sat down, trying to catch his breath. The world felt a little smaller in that moment, a little colder. He glanced back at McAllister's general store, the sting of Clyde's words still fresh in his mind. As he sat there, nursing his wounded pride and his aching knee, Samuel couldn't help but wonder how much more he would have to endure in this life, and how many more men like Clyde he would have to face. Samuel sat on the bench, his breathing slow and steady, but the pain in his knee growing sharper by the minute. He stared down the street, watching the busy world around him continue as if nothing had happened. It felt almost surreal, how invisible his pain seemed to everyone else. The woman who had helped him, a kind stranger named Clara, stood nearby, biting her lip in concern. "You should really see a doctor," she insisted again, her voice gentle but firm. Samuel shook his head slightly. "I've lived through worse," he muttered. "Just need to rest for a bit." Clara hesitated, looking like she wanted to argue, but she saw the stubbornness in Samuel's eyes. "All right," she said, though her tone was unconvinced. "But if you need anything, my shop's just around the corner." Samuel nodded in thanks as Clara walked away, casting one last worried glance over her shoulder. He appreciated her kindness, but he wasn't ready to accept help. Not yet. Not after the way Clyde had treated him in that store. He needed time to process everything, time to get his thoughts together. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, Samuel's mind wandered back to his family. His daughter, Maria, had been calling him more often lately, worried about his health. Maria was his pride and joy, a successful lawyer in New York who always made time to check in on him despite her busy schedule. He hadn't told her about the difficulties he'd been facing, about men like Clyde or the strain of getting older. Samuel wasn't one to burden others with his troubles, especially not his daughter, who had her own life to live. But today, as he sat alone on that bench, the weight of his silence felt heavier than usual. Maybe he should tell her. Maybe it was time to let someone else in. Lost in thought, Samuel didn't notice the small group of teenagers approaching until one of them, a lanky boy with a baseball cap turned backward, spoke up. "Hey, old man," the boy sneered. "What are you doing sitting out here all alone?" Samuel looked up, his eyes narrowing. There were 4 of them, all young, probably no older than 17 or 18, but they carried themselves with an arrogance that made them seem older. They were trouble, he could tell that much. "Just minding my own business," Samuel replied calmly, hoping to avoid any further confrontation. He was in no mood for this. The boy who had spoken snorted. "Looks like you're too old to do much else." His friends laughed at the jab. Samuel clenched his cane a little tighter, trying to keep his composure. He'd dealt with bullies before, but this day had already taken enough out of him. He didn't want it to escalate further. One of the other boys, shorter with a buzz cut, stepped forward. "Come on, let's see what the old man's got in his pockets," he said with a grin, clearly enjoying the power of the moment. Before Samuel could react, the boy lunged forward, reaching for Samuel's coat pocket. Samuel swatted his hand away with the cane, his heart pounding as adrenaline coursed through his veins. "Leave me be," Samuel barked, his voice rising with anger. But the boys only laughed, their sneers deepening. The leader stepped closer, his smile fading into something more sinister. "You think you can just talk to us like that?" His tone was low and threatening. At that moment, a police car rounded the corner. The boys froze, their eyes darting towards the approaching vehicle. Without another word, they turned and bolted down the street, disappearing into an alley before the officer could even see them. Samuel exhaled a shaky breath, his hands trembling from the encounter. His knee throbbed, a reminder that he was no longer as strong or as fast as he once was. The world was changing, and not for the better. The police car slowed to a stop, and a young officer stepped out. He couldn't have been much older than the teenagers, fresh-faced and full of energy. His uniform was crisp, and his expression was serious as he approached. "Everything all right here, sir?" the officer asked, glancing down the street where the boys had fled. Samuel nodded, though his pride felt bruised. "Just some kids causing trouble." The officer frowned. "Do you need me to file a report? I could get their descriptions." "No need for that," Samuel interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "They're just kids. Let it be." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure whether to press the issue, but eventually he nodded. "All right, if you're sure. But if you need anything, don't hesitate to call." Samuel nodded his thanks as the officer returned to his car and drove off. Alone once more, Samuel leaned back on the bench, his body aching and his spirit weary. It was becoming clearer to him that the world wasn't going to be kind to an old man like him anymore. He thought again of his daughter, Maria. Maybe it was time to call her. He didn't want to admit it, but he couldn't face all of this alone. Not anymore. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, Samuel finally gave in to the nagging thought that had been on his mind all day. He pulled out his phone, staring at the screen for a moment, debating whether or not to call Maria. He didn't want to worry her, especially with everything she was juggling in her career, but the day's events weighed too heavily on him to keep silent any longer. With a sigh, he dialed her number, holding the phone to his ear as it rang. "Hey, Dad." Maria's bright voice answered after the second ring. "I've been meaning to call you. How are you doing?" Samuel hesitated for a moment before replying. "I've had better days, to be honest." There was a pause on the other end of the line. He could picture her sitting at her desk, her brow furrowing in concern. "What's going on? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Samuel said quickly, not wanting to alarm her too much. "Just had a bit of a rough day." "Dad," Maria's voice softened. "Talk to me. What happened?" Samuel leaned back against the bench, staring up at the darkening sky. For a few seconds, he wasn't sure where to begin. "You remember that corner store I used to go to? The one on Elm Street?" "Yeah, I know the one," Maria replied, her voice still tinged with concern. "Why?" "Well, I went there today and the owner, Clyde, refused to serve me. Said I wasn't welcome anymore." "What?" Maria sounded shocked. "Why on earth would he say that? You've been going there for years." Samuel shook his head, though she couldn't see him. "I don't know. Something about me causing trouble last time I was in there. But I haven't done anything." Maria's silence spoke volumes. Samuel could practically hear her anger simmering beneath the surface. "This is ridiculous," she finally said. "You should have called me right away, Dad. This sounds like racism," Samuel finished for her, his voice flat. "Yeah, I know." Maria sighed heavily. "I hate that you're still dealing with this nonsense. It's 2024, for God's sake. How can people still be so ignorant?" Samuel didn't have an answer for her. He had asked himself the same question 1,000 times, but the world didn't seem interested in changing. "Are you okay, though?" Maria asked after a brief pause. "I mean, really okay?" Samuel hesitated, not wanting to burden her with the full weight of what he had been feeling. But after everything that had happened today, the humiliation, the pain in his knee, the confrontation with the teenagers, he knew he couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. "Honestly, I'm tired, Maria," he admitted. "Tired of feeling like I don't belong in my own community anymore. Tired of being treated like I don't matter." Maria was silent for a moment, and Samuel wondered if he had said too much. But when she spoke again, her voice was filled with quiet determination. "Dad, you matter. Don't ever forget that. And you don't have to deal with this on your own. I'll come visit this weekend. We can figure something out. Maybe file a complaint against that store owner, or—" "No," Samuel interrupted gently. "I don't want to stir up more trouble. It's just one store. I'll find somewhere else to go." But it's not just about the store, Maria insisted. It's about you being treated with the respect you deserve. Samuel smiled softly at her words, touched by her fierce protectiveness. I know, sweetheart, I know, but some battles just aren't worth fighting. Maria didn't respond immediately, and Samuel could tell she was biting back a retort. She was a fighter, always had been, even as a little girl. She hated injustice in any form, and she had made it her mission in life to stand up for what was right. It was part of what made her such a successful lawyer, but it also made it hard for her to accept when things couldn't be changed with a fight. All right, she finally said, her voice resigned, but you have to promise me you'll let me know if anything else happens. And if you need anything at all, you'll call me. I promise, Samuel said softly. And thank you, Maria. You've always been there for me. That's what family's for, she replied, her voice warm. Take care of yourself, Dad. I love you. Love you too, baby girl. As the call ended, Samuel felt a mixture of relief and guilt. He hadn't told her everything, hadn't mentioned the boys who had tried to rob him, or how he had felt so vulnerable in that moment. But for now, it was enough. Maria would come visit soon, and just knowing that she cared gave him the strength to push forward. Samuel slowly stood up, his cane supporting his weight as he limped towards his apartment building. His knee was still throbbing, but the pain felt more bearable now. The world hadn't changed, and he knew he would face more challenges ahead, but at least he wasn't facing them alone. The days passed quietly after Samuel's conversation with Maria. He went through his usual routine, though with a lingering sense of unease that followed him like a shadow. He hadn't returned to Clyde's store, choosing instead to shop at a place a few blocks further away. But even as he tried to push the incident out of his mind, the weight of it remained. It was a Thursday afternoon when the knock came at his door. Samuel, who had been reading in his favorite chair by the window, felt his heart skip a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the knock was firm, almost insistent. With a slight groan, he pushed himself up, grabbed his cane, and made his way to the door. When he opened it, he found a tall man standing on the other side, dressed in a sharp suit. His expression was serious, his gaze intense as he looked Samuel over. "Mr. Samuel Thompson?" the man asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Samuel frowned, his grip tightening on the doorframe. "Who's asking?" The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, holding it up for Samuel to see. "My name's Jack Stevens. I'm an attorney representing Clyde Baker, the owner of the convenience store on Elm Street." Samuel's stomach twisted. "What do you want?" Jack took a breath, his expression softening slightly. "I'm here to talk about the incident that took place at the store a few days ago." "There's nothing to talk about," Samuel said firmly, stepping back as if to close the door. "I've moved on." But Jack quickly raised a hand, stopping him. "Please, Mr. Thompson, hear me out. This is important." Samuel hesitated, glancing at the card in Jack's hand before sighing and stepping aside. "Fine, come in, but make it quick." Jack nodded and stepped inside, his eyes scanning the small, modest apartment. Samuel motioned for him to sit, but Jack remained standing. "I understand you had a confrontation with Mr. Baker," Jack began, his tone careful. Samuel let out a bitter laugh. "Confrontation? He refused to serve me, said I wasn't welcome in his store anymore. That's not a confrontation. That's discrimination." Jack's jaw tightened. "Mr. Baker insists that there was a misunderstanding. He claims that." "I don't care what he claims," Samuel interrupted, his voice rising. "I've been going to that store for years. He never had a problem with me until now. You tell me what's changed." Jack was silent for a moment, his eyes studying Samuel's face. "Mr. Baker mentioned that there had been a string of robberies in the area recently. He said he thought you might have been involved." Samuel stared at him in disbelief, a sharp, burning anger rising in his chest. "Involved? You're telling me he thinks I'm a criminal now?" Jack held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not saying it's right. I'm just telling you what he said." Samuel shook his head, feeling a cold wave of sadness wash over him. After all these years, he thinks I'm some kind of thug because I'm black. That's what this is about, isn't it? Jack hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know the full story, Mr. Thompson, but I do know that Mr. Baker is willing to meet with you to clear the air. Samuel couldn't believe what he was hearing. You think I want to sit down with that man after what he did? After he humiliated me in front of everyone? Jack's face softened, his voice lowering. I understand how you feel, but Mr. Baker doesn't want this to escalate any further. He's offering to apologize, to make amends. Samuel felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. Amends? What does that even mean? A sorry doesn't erase what he did. No, it doesn't, Jack agreed quietly. But it's a start, and it might help bring some closure for both of you. For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, the weight of Jack's words hanging between them. Samuel's mind raced, torn between his anger and a strange curiosity. He didn't want anything from Clyde, certainly not an apology, but the idea of facing him, of forcing Clyde to acknowledge what he had done. That was tempting. Finally, Samuel let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Fine, I'll meet him, but I'm not doing it for him. I'm doing it for me. Jack nodded, his expression relieved. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'll arrange the meeting. As Jack turned to leave, Samuel's voice stopped him. One more thing. Jack turned back, raising an eyebrow. If this is some kind of trick, if Clyde thinks he can smooth this over without taking responsibility, I'm walking out. And this time, I won't be quiet about it. Jack's face grew serious, and he nodded again. Understood. As the door closed behind him, Samuel sank back into his chair, his mind spinning with thoughts of the upcoming meeting. He wasn't sure what he hoped to gain from it, but one thing was certain. Clyde Baker would have to answer for what he had done. The next day arrived faster than Samuel had anticipated. His heart raced with anticipation and an undercurrent of anxiety as he prepared himself for the meeting with Clyde. This wasn't something he'd expected to face at this point in his life, and the idea of confronting Clyde again stirred up a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Still, he knew he had to do it, for his dignity, for his peace of mind. Jack Stevens had arranged the meeting in a small cafe, just a few blocks from Clyde's store. As Samuel arrived, leaning slightly on his cane, he noticed Jack standing near the entrance, waiting for him. Mr. Thompson. Jack greeted him with a nod. Thank you for coming. Samuel nodded stiffly, his eyes scanning the room. He spotted Clyde sitting at a table near the back, fidgeting nervously with his hands. The sight of the man made Samuel's stomach turn, but he took a deep breath, steadying himself. Let's get this over with, Samuel muttered, walking past Jack toward the table. As he approached, Clyde stood, looking awkward and out of place. His eyes darted to Samuel before quickly looking away, as though ashamed to meet his gaze. Mr. Thompson, Clyde said quietly, his voice lacking the bravado Samuel had heard in the store. I'm glad you came. Samuel didn't respond right away. Instead, he lowered himself into the chair across from Clyde, setting his cane beside him and folding his hands on the table. I'm here because your lawyer asked me to be, Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. Now, what do you want? Clyde shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands trembling slightly. Look, Samuel, I messed up. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. I made assumptions, and they were wrong. Samuel stared at him, his face expressionless. Assumptions? You mean you saw a black man in your store and figured he must be a thief? Clyde winced at the bluntness of Samuel's words, but he nodded slowly. Yeah, that's exactly what I thought. I've been on edge because of the robberies, and I let my fear get the better of me. Fear? Samuel repeated, his voice heavy with disdain. Is that what you call it? I've known you for years, Clyde, and not once did you ever say or do anything like this. So what changed? Clyde swallowed hard, his eyes finally meeting Samuel's. I don't know, man. Maybe it's always been there and I just didn't see it. Or maybe I've been listening to too many people around me who've got their own biases. Samuel felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. That's a convenient excuse, Clyde, but it doesn't fix what you did. I know, Clyde said quickly, his voice pleading. I'm not trying to make excuses. I know I hurt you. I know I humiliated you, and I wish I could take it back. Samuel shook his head slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. You can't take it back. You can't undo the fact that you looked at me and saw a criminal, that you treated me like I was less than human, and all because of the color of my skin. Clyde's face crumpled, guilt and shame written all over his features. I'm sorry, Samuel. I'm truly sorry. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with tension and unspoken pain. Samuel could feel the old wounds that had been ripped open by Clyde's actions, and he wondered if an apology could ever truly heal them. But then, in the silence, something shifted inside Samuel. He realized that holding on to his anger wouldn't make things better. It wouldn't change what had happened, and it wouldn't give him the peace he so desperately needed. I don't know if I can forgive you, Clyde, Samuel said softly, his voice trembling slightly. But I'm not here for you. I'm here for myself. I need to move on from this. I need to find peace. Clyde nodded slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. I understand, and I hope one day you can forgive me. But even if you can't, I want you to know that I'm going to do better. I'm going to work on myself, and I'll never let something like this happen again. Samuel didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure if Clyde's words were enough, but he knew that they were a start. He had come to this meeting with anger and pain, but now, as he looked at the man sitting across from him, he realized that he didn't want to carry that burden anymore. I hope you do better, Samuel finally said, his voice steady, because no one deserves to go through what you put me through. Clyde wiped a tear from his cheek and nodded. I won't forget this, Samuel. I promise you that. With that, Samuel stood, taking his cane in hand. He didn't look back as he left the cafe, but as he walked out into the cool afternoon air, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The pain was still there, but it was no longer as sharp. He had faced Clyde, he had spoken his truth, and now he could begin to heal. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Samuel knew one thing for certain. He had his dignity, and that was something no one could ever take from him again.